You have surely seen this weapon from World War II, the legendary MP40, but do you really know the turbulent history behind it and why it was hated by American soldiers so much? If not, today we're going to show you just that. Okay, so let's go way back to the very beginning of German submachine guns, so you can see why the MP40 turned out the way it did. In the beginning of the 20th century, armies were focusing on long-range surplus bolt-action rifles. Power, precision, and range were seen as the most important aspects of rifles. But then the concept of the submachine gun was born in the First World War, and it was the complete opposite of this. You may wonder why. Well, because with the appearance of water-cooled machine guns and quick-firing artillery, the open, mobile form of warfare with infantry and cavalry charges broke down into a deadlock of trenches, which, for the first time in history, reached such a horrible level in the First World War. No side could outmaneuver the other, because the first aeroplanes provided aerial reconnaissance and real-time data, which was completely new. So neither side could predict each other's movements. And that is how trenches quickly spread one against another, with no one able to break them. The warring sides were shelling each other and fighting off charge after charge with horrific losses, with no solution in sight. So it is here that, instead of large-scale open charges that proved so costly, the focus went to small raiding parties that would use the cover of darkness to crawl over no man's land and infiltrate enemy trenches. The 1-meter-long 5-shot rifles that were accurate up to 1,000 meters couldn't help them in savage close quarters fighting in narrow trenches. Neither could the 100-pound Maxim water-cooled machine gun. Pistols and revolvers provided too little firepower with just a couple of bullets, so all sides tried to find the best solution that would work in such circumstances. The Americans had their infamous trench shotgun, but the Germans were among the first to come up with reliable submachine guns to arm their elite stormtroopers. The term submachine gun is basically used to distinguish them from big machine guns, and it is said that it was actually coined in the marketing of the American Thompson when they came up with this new word, to sound catchy and innovative. Okay, back to the Germans. At first they tried to convert existing pistols to full auto, but they proved too light and uncontrollable for this. So Theodor Bergmann's firm and designer Hugo Schmeisser developed the world's first practical submachine gun. It was the Maschinenpistole 18, or in short, MP18, introduced in 1918 as a trench sweeper. It had a 32-round drum magazine chambered in a 9mm pistol round and fired between 350 and 500 rounds per minute, which, for the time, was much better than anything else to fight in trenches. It saw action for the first time in the German Spring Offensive of 1918, in which special stormtrooper units broke the stalemate of trench warfare. They shocked the Allied soldiers with so-called walking fire tactics in close-quarters combat, spraying the trenches with automatic fire. Though the offensive eventually failed and only just under 30,000 MP18s were produced, they made quite a dramatic impression in the final months of the war and opened the eyes of other nations to what small, pistol-caliber, fast-firing weapons could do. So very soon, nearly every submachine gun created from that point on until the end of World War II had some elements borrowed from Schmeisser's creation. The Italians had this weird-looking Villa Perosa, essentially two machine pistols fixed together for some reason, while the Americans got their famous Thompson in .45 ACP caliber. However, the end of the war didn't mean the end of German submachine guns, because they were already preparing for round two that would come a couple of years later. Despite the restrictions of the Treaty of Versailles, the Germans were developing their weapons at full steam in preparation for the new global conflict. The MP38 was introduced using a simpler straight box magazine instead of the drum, and the concept continued to be refined as it proved so successful. Observing the lessons from the Spanish Civil War, where the Germans used the opportunity to test their tactics and new weapons, they yet again saw the effectiveness of submachine guns in street fighting, and they were now sure that, even for the new war, which they expected to be more mobile and not fought in trenches like the previous one, submachine guns were still going to be an effective tool. They issued a new requirement in 1938 for a new machine pistol, and designer Heinrich Vollmer answered with the MP38, specifically created for the Wehrmacht. Unlike earlier wooden stocked designs, this one was quite futuristic. The first one with no wood at all and with a folding stock. This made it compact when the fighting was really close and you wanted, for example, to clear a house, or to make it handier for crews of armored vehicles. The receiver was machined steel, while the foregrip and pistol grip were made of bakelite, which was an early form of plastic. Although it looked fancy, this created a problem after sustained firing, because these materials conducted heat much more than wood, so you'd usually see soldiers in World War II photos wearing gloves, because they quickly learned how hot the gun would be after a couple of fired magazines. Later there was also a rare version, the MP41, with a wooden stock. Volmer also mounted the charging handle on the left side, with the idea that the soldier could still keep his hand on the trigger while reloading or clearing a jam. It operated on a simple open bolt blowback design and was chambered in the well-known German cartridge 9mm Parabellum, firing at some 500 rounds per minute. Basically, it was the same MP18 concept, just packaged and modernized for the new war. It was immediately adopted by the German army that same year. However, only a handful of MP38s would enter World War II. When the Germans invaded Poland, only about 8,000 of them were in service across the entire army, because production ramped up slowly. But they showed they were quite useful in the new form of Blitzkrieg combat. So the Germans now wanted a version that could really be mass-produced, meaning a cheaper and simpler but still effective design. This led to the legendary MP40, of course. The core of the weapon remained basically the same, just optimized for speed of production. Expensive milled parts were replaced with stamped sheet metal pressings and spot welds wherever possible. This significantly improved the production rate, but it didn't come without flaws logically. Troops reported that early versions were prone to jamming because the transition to full-scale mass production was done hurriedly, without proper optimization, but newer models corrected most of the flaws quickly. One important quirk from the MP38 that was corrected in the MP40 was its tendency to accidentally fire. Because it didn't have a proper safety, jolting or dropping the weapon could discharge it, which was not quite the safest thing to do around your fellow troops. But the MP40 solved this with a dual-slot safety notch, basically a bolt handle that could be pushed into a locked position either with the bolt closed or open, which removed the risk of shooting yourself or someone around you if you dropped your MP. However, all in all, the MP40 was mechanically pretty much the same as its older brother, sharing double-stack 32-round box magazines. Interestingly, the magazine design was patented by Hugo Schmeisser, but he didn't have a direct role in developing the MP38 and MP40. Yet because his name was stamped on the magazines, the submachine gun got the nickname Schmeisser. The Germans were now spitting out as many MP40s as they could, and they managed to lower the production cost to 57 Reichsmarks per unit, which is about $1,200 today. So despite lowering the cost, it still wasn't cheap, although the Germans still churned out over 1 million MP40s, making it the second most produced German automatic weapon of World War II, with the MG34 taking first place. However, they produced 14 million Kar 98 rifles, so you see the difference. But if you compare the cost of the MP40 to the American Thompson, which was estimated to cost over $2,000 in today's equivalent, it is much cheaper. The Americans, because of this, introduced the M3, the so-called grease gun, that lowered the cost to as little as $300 in today's money, when they borrowed some of the MP40 features and made it work for the 45 ACP caliber, and simplified it basically as much as possible. The British did the same thing with their Sten submachine gun, which could be produced even for as little as half the cost of the grease gun, at a cost similar to the Soviet PPSH. But we'll compare them a bit more later when you see how these performed on the battlefield and why the MP40 was hated. So the MP40 was never intended to replace the rifles in general service, but to be more of a specialist weapon. Ordinary soldiers would rarely have one, especially early in the war, because it was reserved for leaders, assault groups, and tank crews. You see, the German infantry squad was built around the machine gun, either the MG34 or 42. The machine gun was served by a 3-man crew of gunner, his assistant, and an ammo bearer, and they were the squad's main source of firepower. Another 6 soldiers carried Kar 98 rifles and protected the team, while one officer would be the squad's leader, and he was the only one armed with the MP40. He carried 6 magazines in special pouches, along with a loader tool and a pistol as a sidearm. Paratroopers were among the first to adopt MP40s logically, and panzer divisions used them as well, because in their cramped interiors, a full-size rifle was impractical. But this would change significantly once the Germans ran into the Soviet Red Army on the Eastern Front, and when those horrible city battles took place, like Stalingrad. The Germans here, in the bombed-out ruins of the city where fighting was at very close range, realized the importance of the submachine gun again. But even worse for them, they ran into Soviet squads armed with PPSHs that, although hastily and simply built, proved superior to the much fancier German MP40, and they also outnumbered them in production 6-1. In such battles, the submachine guns were the most suitable weapon, and it got to the point that when the Germans couldn't receive enough MP40s, they began first using captured Soviet PPSHs. Then, going even further, they converted them to fire 9mm instead of 7.62 Tokarev, and made them work with an adapter for MP40 magazines. Some 10,000 units were converted this way. Even more interestingly, the Soviet PPSH could work with German-produced 7.63 Mauser pistol ammo. This way they could supply the captured guns even without converting them to 9mm. The PPSH actually became the second most common submachine gun in German service, after the MP40 itself, and was used against the very country that produced it, ironically. So let's briefly compare these two first. The PPSH-41, chambered in 7.62 Tokarev, could fire up to 1,200 rounds per minute, and the cartridge itself was smaller but much faster, with better penetration and effective range than the slower-moving 9mm, although the 9mm had better stopping power. However, the very high rate of fire and the fact that it worked in almost any conditions because of its simple design were what won the day. In this kind of combat, you could enter a room full of enemies, and the PPSH could empty its magazine in under 2 seconds and spray everyone inside with bullets. The MP40 couldn't do that as effectively with its much lower rate of fire. However, it was much more controllable and accurate for longer bursts. You can basically fire it, hold it on a target, and empty the whole magazine into it. Also, it conserved ammo better, but in such heavy urban fights you'd want as high a rate of fire as possible, and preferably you wouldn't want your SMG to freeze and jam. The MP40 weighed about 4 kilos unloaded, which is quite heavy for a submachine gun, but it helped absorb the recoil, and the best you could get for effective range was about 100 meters, as it was still a pistol cartridge. The folding stock tended to start wobbling after prolonged use, so accurate sniper shots with it were even more out of the question. The Germans even designed this interesting MP40/1 that held 2 magazines side by side, so the loading time would be significantly shorter. It was intended to answer the Soviet 71-round drum magazines, but only a few hundred were built as they proved impractical. Soldiers in the field used a similar trick by simply carrying pairs of taped magazines, the jungle style, for quicker reloads. However, the real weakness of the MP40 was its magazine and feed system. You see, the magazine was a double-column but single-feed design. This means that rounds are stored side by side, and then the column narrows to one stack at the very end of the magazine, so only one round is going to be loaded at a time. The American Thompson, for example, used a double feed type where rounds were loaded from both sides and were stored not directly beside one another but slightly offset. This was a much more reliable solution because in the MP40's case, its MP18 based design, thin steel magazines, and the unclean conditions of the battlefield with mud and dust could easily cause misfeeds and jam the gun. Soldiers quickly learned to oil their magazines and keep them clean if they wanted them to work during battle. Less experienced soldiers would hold the gun directly by the magazine instead of the small grip built for this, so the magazine could bend and jam the rounds inside. It is even written in the German manual that you should not hold the MP40 by the magazine, and soldiers in the field preferred not to load all 32 rounds but a couple less, so the spring wouldn't be compressed all the way back and risk causing problems with feeding. Also, these magazines were much more difficult to load. The Germans issued a magazine loading tool with each MP40 kit to help with this. It is a simple device that goes over the top of the magazine and presses the rounds inside without the soldier bruising his thumbs after loading 6 magazines. However, the gun itself performed quite reliably even in heavy conditions like the African desert and the Eastern Front, due to its simple direct blowback operating system. But the magazines caused quite a few headaches throughout the war. Allied troops generally avoided using the MP40 in combat, and it was actually strictly forbidden to do so in a couple of instances. You see, the MP40 had a really distinctive sound when firing, and when Allied soldiers used captured ones, it created even more confusion on the battlefield and led to quite a few blue-on-blue incidents. It is recorded that during the US Ranger assault at Pointe du Hoc on D-Day, some of them picked up MP40s from Germans they had killed and used them. It was later reported that 4 Rangers were killed by friendly fire, lying dead beside the German weapons. So soldiers quickly learned the dangers that came with it and avoided using captured enemy weapons if they didn't really have to. Also, American soldiers preferred the better stopping power of the .45 ACP cartridge used in their Thompsons and M3 grease guns over the 9mm, even though it had a slightly shorter effective range. The M3 was literally nothing more than a grease gun that could fire, which tells you how simply and crudely it was made. Unlike the fancy German ergonomics, it didn't even have a charging handle. You had to stick your finger into a cutout on the bolt. The safety was just a simple latch, and the stock was made of bent wire. The British Sten was even cheaper than the M3, and it was also chambered in 9mm like the MP40. While the Germans still centered their main infantry weapon around full-power rifles, they also realized the advantages of higher capacity and faster firing weapons like submachine guns. But they struggled with range, which is why they started looking for an intermediate cartridge. They wanted a round that sat between the overkill of full-power rifles and the underperformance of pistol cartridges, something in the sweet spot of where most fighting actually took place. In World War II, this was mostly under 300 meters. That led them to the Sturmgewehr, or what we know today as the assault rifle. With its 7.92 by 33mm cartridge, the STG-44 was the first real example of that idea. It had a much higher capacity than standard rifles with its 30-round magazine, offered full auto capability for close quarters, and still stayed effective out to around 400 meters, far more than any submachine gun could reach. In 1944, the Sturmgewehr replaced the MP40 in both production and doctrine. The war ended before the Germans could perfect the idea of a universal assault rifle, but they still produced over 400,000 of them and showed the world a concept that would inspire generations of weapons. And doesn't it look suspiciously like the AK-47, which later became the most produced assault rifle on Earth?
Thank you for watching the audio. Please subscribe to the channel to listen to more about other World War II military campaigns. Thank you so much.